An 8-year-old girl disappeared from the capital of the United States. There was no scream in the night, no shattered glass, no frantic 911 call breaking the silence. There was only stillness, followed by paperwork, confusion, and a slow realization that something irreversible had happened. What began as a quiet absence soon expanded into a void that has endured for more than a decade. This is an unsolved mystery, a cold case that refuses to fade. The disappearance of Relisha Rudd in Washington, D.C. in 2014 is not simply the story of a missing child. It is a story about overlooked warnings, misplaced trust, and systems that failed to respond when the signs were already there. What happened to Relisha Rudd? Who failed to protect her? And how can a child vanish in a city defined by power, surveillance, and institutions? Tonight, we step carefully into the silence surrounding her name. Washington, D.C. projects permanence. Marble monuments rise against the skyline. Federal buildings glow under carefully placed lights. An authority feels structured and immovable. Power appears organized here. Systems appear layered and controlled. Yet beyond that architectural symbolism lies another Washington, one less photographed and less discussed, where instability is not theoretical but daily, and survival is negotiated one decision at a time. In 2014, hundreds of families were living inside D.C. General, a former hospital complex in southeast Washington that had been converted into the city's largest family homeless shelter. Originally intended as a temporary solution, the facility had become a long-term holding space for families experiencing housing crises. Reports from city oversight committees and investigative journalists described overcrowded conditions, maintenance issues, and limited supervision. For many residents, it was not a bridge to stability, but a prolonged state of uncertainty. Relisha Rudd lived inside that structure with her mother, Shamika Young, her grandmother, and several siblings. She was 8 years old in early 2014. On school records, she was listed as a second grader, enrolled at Payne Elementary School. On paper, she was just another child navigating the public education system. In reality, she was a child growing up inside an environment shaped by poverty, transience, and institutional strain. Teachers later described Relisha as bright, affectionate, and expressive. She liked colorful clothes and enjoyed attention. She smiled easily. She was known to talk about wanting to be important when she grew up, a phrase that carries weight when spoken by a child who lives in circumstances that often render people invisible. That aspiration reflected a quiet hunger for recognition, for stability, for a sense of being seen. Children raised in shelters often develop heightened social awareness. They learn to read adult moods quickly. They understand tension without it being explained. They adapt to shifting routines. Research in child psychology consistently shows that chronic housing instability increases stress levels in children, affecting both attendance and emotional regulation. Relisha was adapting. In her own way, she was described as resilient. But resilience in a child should never be mistaken for protection. Her school attendance began to change in early 2014, according to publicly released records and media investigations. Relisha missed more than 30 days of school during February and March. That number is not a minor fluctuation. It signals a significant disruption. Each absence was accompanied by documentation explaining that she was under medical care. The notes appeared formal. They bore a signature indicating a medical professional had authorized her absence, but the name on the documentation was not a licensed physician. It was Kahlil Tatum, a 51-year-old janitor employed at D.C. General. This detail did not immediately trigger alarm within the school system. The notes were accepted for weeks. The verification process did not escalate until much later. That delay has since become central to public criticism of institutional response. Tatum worked as a maintenance employee at the shelter. His position gave him daily access to residents. He moved freely through hallways and residential spaces. In large communal environments, maintenance staff are often perceived as neutral fixtures, present but not scrutinized. Familiarity reduces suspicion. Over time, boundaries blur. According to later police reports and media coverage, Tatum developed a relationship with Relisha and her family. Witnesses described seeing him spend time with her, occasionally taking her off-site. Her mother reportedly told school officials that Tatum was taking Relisha to medical appointments. This explanation aligned with the excused notes being submitted. On the surface, the narrative held together. A 51-year-old man spending private time with an 80-year-old child should have raised immediate concern. Yet context matters. In environments marked by instability, assistance can appear as relief. If a staff member offers transportation or help navigating appointments, that offer may be accepted without deep background checks by the family itself. The psychological weight of survival can compress vigilance. Public records later showed Tatum had prior allegations involving inappropriate conduct with minors, intensifying scrutiny of hiring and oversight at D.C. General. Though not all accusations led to convictions, critics questioned whether warning signs were properly assessed. Criminological research notes that predatory behavior often begins not with violence, but with grooming, an incremental process that builds trust, gradually isolates the child, and reframes boundaries, with the adult presenting himself as protector, while quietly integrating into the family's life. D.C. General, by many accounts, was not structurally designed to conceal crime. It was designed as emergency housing. However, chaos itself can create concealment. Hundreds of residents entered and exited daily. Caseworkers were responsible for large caseloads. Oversight mechanisms were stretched, and systems are overloaded. Subtle behavioral irregularities can dissolve into background noise. Relisha's daily life unfolded within that fragile architecture. She lived in the capital of the United States, but her world consisted of shared spaces, crowded rooms, and adults managing financial and emotional strain. The monuments downtown did not shield her from the vulnerabilities of her immediate environment. For weeks, normalcy seemed intact. Relisha's absences grew, notes were processed, and no urgent alarm disrupted routine. Officials later acknowledged the delayed recognition of forged documents as a critical failure. Systemic breakdown rarely stems from one dramatic mistake, but from small lapses. An unchecked form, a pattern overlooked, a relationship insufficiently questioned. Individually minor, together they create a corridor of risk. Already vulnerable, due to housing instability, Relisha faced heightened exposure to disruption and harm. Research from the National Center on Family Homelessness shows homeless children experience greater academic and safety risks, deepening that vulnerability. By the time school officials questioned the medical notes in March 2014, crucial weeks had already slipped away. The case did not begin with panic but with paperwork, attendance logs, and unverified signatures quietly accepted as routine. The danger did not arrive loudly. It blended into administrative normalcy. When institutions finally reacted, the protective systems around Relisha had already fallen out of sync, and in that delay, she had drifted further into uncertainty than anyone realized. In February and March of 2014, 8-year-old Relisha Rudd missed more than 30 days of school in Washington, D.C. Each absence was accompanied by documentation stating she was under medical supervision. The notes carried the signature of Kahlil Tatum, presented as though he were a licensed physician. On paper, the explanation appeared structured and legitimate. In reality, it was fabricated. At the time, Relisha Rudd and her family were living at the former D.C. General Family Shelter, the city's largest emergency shelter for homeless families, housing hundreds of residents, many of them children. Later reports from the D.C. Interagency Council on Homelessness and the Office of the Inspector General of the District of Columbia cited overcrowding and oversight gaps. There, Kahlil Tatum worked as a janitor, with routine access to families. School administrators processed the medical notes as they would any other documentation. In large public school systems, attendance offices manage hundreds of cases weekly. Forms that appear properly signed often move forward without forensic scrutiny. Bureaucratic systems depend on efficiency and assumption. Only later did officials acknowledge that the failure to verify the medical credentials associated with the notes represented a critical breakdown in hindsight. The warning signs were stark. Tatum was not a doctor. He had no medical training, yet his name was accepted repeatedly as an authority. The delay in verifying the information allowed weeks to pass without meaningful intervention. During that period, surveillance footage later obtained by investigators showed Tatum and Relisha together at multiple hotels in the Washington metropolitan area. They checked into at least one hotel in Northeast D.C., appearing calm and unhurt. No visible signs of distress were apparent in the footage. Criminological research on child exploitation consistently notes that predatory behavior often relies on gradual grooming rather than overt force. Grooming can involve positioning oneself as a benefactor, offering gifts, attention, or perceived stability, particularly powerful dynamics in environments marked by poverty and housing insecurity. According to the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, exploitative relationships frequently develop through incremental boundary shifts that appear benign to outside observers. A child walking beside an adult in a public lobby does not automatically signal danger. The last confirmed sighting of Relisha occurred in late March 2014, when security cameras recorded her entering a hotel with Tatum. After that moment, she was not captured again on verified surveillance footage. For days, there was no public alarm. Her absences continued to be processed administratively. Eventually, school officials began questioning the legitimacy of the medical documentation. An internal review triggered attempts to verify the physician's credentials. When administrators contacted medical licensing authorities, they discovered no such doctor existed. The name on the notes matched the shelter janitor. Authorities were notified. By that time, critical days had elapsed. In missing child investigations, early response windows are widely regarded as decisive. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has emphasized that the first 24 to 48 hours can significantly affect recovery outcomes, delays narrow investigative leads, and complicate evidence collection. When law enforcement sought to locate Tatum, the case escalated sharply. His wife, Andrea Tatum, was discovered deceased in a Prince George's County hotel room. She had been shot. Investigators later indicated that her death occurred shortly before the missing child case became public knowledge. The sequence suggested rapid destabilization. Domestic homicide experts often note that when individuals fear exposure or legal consequences, behavior can escalate unpredictably. A regional manhunt followed. Multiple law enforcement agencies searched parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings across the District of Columbia and neighboring Maryland. The search extended into areas such as Kenilworth Park and aquatic gardens. Public alerts were issued. Community volunteers joined organized search efforts. Media coverage intensified nationally, framing the case as both a missing child investigation and a broader systemic failure. Weeks later, in April 2014, Kahlil Tatum was found deceased in a park in Washington, D.C. Authorities ruled his death a suicide. The suspected primary offender was no longer alive to answer questions, yet Relisha was not found with him. No confirmed remains were discovered in the immediate vicinity. The manhunt ended, but the central mystery deepened. If Tatum was responsible for harming Relisha, investigators have never publicly established when or where it occurred. The absence of physical evidence has complicated definitive conclusions. Suicide following alleged crimes can reflect a range of psychological factors, including avoidance of prosecution, shame, or a desire to retain control over the narrative. In criminal psychology literature, such acts can deny investigators the clarity of confession, leaving families suspended in prolonged uncertainty. For Relisha's family, Tatum's death did not provide closure. It removed the only individual who may have known the full sequence of events. The case remains officially unsolved. Over the years, city officials and advocacy groups have cited Relisha's disappearance in broader discussions about reforming family, sheltered oversight, and improving interagency communication. In 2015 and 2016, the district government initiated structural changes to phase out the D.C. General Facility, citing concerns about safety and conditions. The weeks preceding Relisha's disappearance reveal a pattern of quiet drift, absences, assumed authority, and a relationship insufficiently questioned. Then came sudden violence, flight, and silence. The tragedy exists at the intersection of individual criminality and institutional vulnerability. Poverty did not cause the crime, but housing instability placed Relisha within a fragile network of oversight. When institutional fatigue intersects with personal predation, risk multiplies. More than a decade later, her case remains open. Age-progressed images have been released periodically in hopes that someone, somewhere, might recognize her. The questions endure with uncomfortable weight. If the man suspected of involvement is gone, and no trace of Relisha has been found, where is she? How did the warning signs remain dormant for so long? And what safeguards must evolve to ensure that silence does not again mask a child's disappearance in plain sight? Once the disappearance of Relisha Rudd became public in March 2014, the response intensified dramatically. The Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia mobilized search teams across the city. Helicopters scanned wooded areas. Officers canvassed neighborhoods, distributed flyers, and interviewed shelter residents. Dive teams searched nearby waterways, including stretches of the Anacostia River. Parks and abandoned buildings were combed methodically. The case quickly shifted from a school attendance inquiry to a full-scale missing child investigation. By the time the search fully mobilized, crucial weeks had already slipped away. Investigators retraced the movements of Kahlil Tatum, reviewing hotel records and surveillance footage from Washington, D.C. and Prince George's County, Maryland. Documentation showed he used his identification to rent rooms, while accompanied by Relisha Rudd. Detectives reconstructed timelines through receipts, camera images, and digital data. But the effort was reactive, an attempt to understand events already completed in missing child cases. Early hours are critical. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children stresses immediate reporting and coordinated response. Relisha had accumulated over 30 absences before forged medical notes were challenged, shifting the investigation from prevention to aftermath analysis. National media coverage expanded rapidly, with outlets including the Washington Post, CNN, and NBC News reporting extensively. Public outrage reached beyond Kahlil Tatum to the institutions surrounding Relisha Rudd. Press conferences and community meetings echoed with questions about prolonged school absences, unverified medical notes, and how a shelter employee maintained repeated, unsupervised access to a vulnerable child. Attention shifted toward accountability as the Council of the District of Columbia convened public hearings examining oversight failures at the former D.C. General Family Shelter. A subsequent review by the Office of the Inspector General of the District of Columbia detailed interagency communication breakdowns, unclear reporting lines, insufficient documentation review, and weaknesses in supervision protocols that allowed warning signs to go unaddressed. The investigation centered heavily on Tatum as the primary suspect. Circumstantial evidence pointed strongly in his direction. He was the last confirmed adult seen with Relisha. He had falsified medical documentation presented to school officials. On March 20, 2014, his wife, Andrea Tatum, was found shot to death in a Maryland hotel room. Authorities indicated that her death occurred shortly before Relisha was reported missing publicly. Shortly afterward, Tatum fled, triggering a regional manhunt. Behavioral analysts often interpret such patterns as escalating concealment. Forgery suggests calculated deception. Spousal homicide may indicate crisis, exposure anxiety, or destabilization. Flight signals fear of apprehension. Weeks later, in April 2014, Tatum was found deceased in a park in northeast Washington. The medical examiner ruled his death a suicide. For investigators, the suspected central figure was gone, but Relisha was not with him. No confirmed remains were discovered near his body or in the immediate search perimeter. Without physical evidence directly linking Tatum to Relisha's death, legal certainty remains incomplete. Officially, she is still classified as missing. Law enforcement has publicly stated that foul play is presumed, yet the absence of a body complicates formal closure. In criminology and trauma research, this condition is often described as ambiguous loss, a term coined by family therapist Pauline Boss to describe grief without confirmation. Families in such cases experience suspended mourning, able to fully extinguish hope, yet unable to achieve resolution. Public anger intensified as overlapping institutional responsibilities became clearer. Child and Family Services, District of Columbia Public Schools, shelter administrators, and law enforcement each operated within distinct bureaucratic structures. Communication between these entities was limited by procedural boundaries. In complex municipal systems, responsibility can diffuse across agencies. Each office may assume another is verifying details more thoroughly. The gaps between institutions become invisible corridors where risk accumulates quietly. The spotlight on Washington, D.C. intensified as the case exposed gaps within its municipal systems. Data from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development showed that thousands of children in the district faced housing instability, with advocates warning that overcrowded shelters strained oversight. In response, officials moved to close the D.C. General Family Shelter, which was shuttered in 2018 and replaced with smaller facilities, citing Relisha's case as a catalyst for reforms in supervision and child safety. Yet systemic failure does not eliminate individual accountability. If Tatum acted alone, his psychology remained central to understanding the case. Investigators searched wooded areas, including Kenilworth Park and aquatic gardens, extensively. They followed digital leads and examined forensic evidence recovered from hotel rooms. Despite expansive efforts, definitive proof of Relisha's fate was not recovered. As weeks turned into months, national media attention gradually shifted. News cycles moved forward, other crises emerged. But for Relisha's family and many in the district, the absence did not resolve. The official narrative expressed belief that she likely died before Tatum's suicide. Still, likely does not equal confirmed. Uncertainty sustained speculation and sorrow simultaneously. The case eventually settled into cold status though. Files remain open. Each progressed images have been released periodically by the Metropolitan Police Department in hopes that new information might surface. Leads have diminished over time, but investigators continue to state that tips are reviewed. Failure remains inseparable from the story, not as abstraction, but as a chain of incremental missteps, checked documentation, insufficient cross-agency alerts, and assumptions that routine paperwork equated to safety. When examining cases like this, it is tempting to isolate a single villain and close the chapter. Yet the architecture surrounding the crime demands scrutiny alongside the suspect's actions. Relisha's disappearance exposed both the potential cruelty of one individual and the fragility of protective systems designed for vulnerable children. The search teams eventually dispersed. Helicopters no longer circle, but the structural questions continue to echo. How can institutions synchronize more effectively? How can warning signs be verified before weeks pass? And how can silence be recognized not as routine, but as a signal requiring urgent attention? To understand how a child can disappear within a densely populated city like Washington, D.C., it is necessary to examine the fractures beneath the visible surface. Urban environments create an illusion of constant surveillance cameras, institutions, agencies, overlapping authorities. Yet visibility does not equal protection. Beneath that surface operate quieter forces: poverty, housing instability, administrative overload, and emotional fatigue. These pressures shape decision-making in subtle, cumulative ways. At the time of her disappearance, Relisha Rudd and her family were living in emergency shelter housing. Homelessness does not simply mean the absence of permanent shelter. Research from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has consistently shown that housing instability disrupts schooling, healthcare continuity, and family cohesion. It erodes predictability. Daily routines become fragile. Caregivers must navigate transportation barriers, bureaucratic appointments, and uncertainty about where they will sleep weeks later. Chronic stress alters cognitive bandwidth. Decisions that might seem obvious from a distance can become blurred under survival pressure. Reports indicated that Relisha Rudd's mother had prior contact with social services, a sign of vulnerability rather than automatic neglect. Families in crisis often juggle agency requirements, unstable employment, and housing insecurity at the same time. Preserving dignity under those pressures demands constant negotiation. In such conditions, trust can become transactional. When someone in authority offers transportation, gifts, or help with paperwork, assistance may be accepted without deep scrutiny, as survival leaves little space for sustained suspicion. Within the former D.C. General Family Shelter, oversight was complex. The facility housed hundreds of families. Multiple agencies operated within overlapping jurisdictions. Staff members, contractors, caseworkers, and administrators interacted daily with residents. In such environments, authority can feel diffuse. Responsibility disperses across roles. When many adults are present, each may assume another is observing more closely. Psychologists describe this phenomenon as diffusion of responsibility, dynamic, well documented in social psychology research since the 1960s. When warning signs are ambiguous rather than dramatic, intervention is often delayed. Kahlil Tatum worked in a service role within that environment. Public records later revealed he had faced prior allegations involving inappropriate conduct with minors. Though not all allegations resulted in convictions, the debate over whether those concerns were thoroughly investigated continues. Psychologically, However, the pattern aligns with research showing that individuals who engage in exploitative behavior frequently seek environments where oversight is fragmented and access to vulnerable populations is routine. Shelters, youth programs, and communal housing can provide both opportunity and anonymity. The offender blends into institutional structure. Witness accounts later indicated that Relisha was often seen walking with Tatum. Some individuals reported discomfort in hindsight, but did not file formal complaints at the time. Ambiguity plays a powerful role in bystander inaction. A child walking calmly beside an adult employee does not immediately signal danger, especially when the adult holds a recognized position. The absence of visible distress reduces urgency. Each observer may rationalize what they see as harmless. It is only after a disappearance that ordinary images acquire ominous weight. Children raised in unstable environments often adapt by seeking stable attachments wherever they appear. Developmental psychology research suggests that consistent attention from an adult even outside the family can feel protective. If a child experiences unpredictability at home or within housing transitions, focused attention may register as safety rather than threat. Grooming behaviors exploit precisely this dynamic. Grooming does not begin with overt violence. It begins with trust building, small gifts, shared outings, private conversations framed as mentorship or care. Boundaries shift gradually. The relationship is reframed as beneficial. If grooming occurred in this case, it likely unfolded incrementally. Tatum's employment status would have granted him credibility within the shelter community. Familiarity normalizes proximity. Repetition dulls alarm. Access to semi-private spaces within institutional settings can make unusual interactions appear routine. The slow accumulation of small exceptions can erode safeguards without triggering immediate review. The most painful aspect of this case is not only the possibility of individual criminal harm, but that multiple safeguards failed to activate together. The school system processed medical notes without verifying licensure. Shelter staff did not escalate concerns about unusual proximity, and social services did not trigger cross-agency review despite prolonged absences. Each lapse seemed administrative on its own. Collectively, they created a corridor for risk. Large bureaucracies prioritized efficiencies through standardized procedures, but high caseloads and institutional fatigue can cause subtle warning signs to blend into routine irregularities when examining trauma cases. Public discourse often seeks a single defining moment, the night something happened, the act that changed everything. Yet many tragedies are cumulative. They are constructed from overlooked signals, normalized exceptions, and fragmented communication. No single decision causes the outcome. The convergence, thus Relisha's psychological profile, as described by those who knew her, suggested a child who responded warmly to attention and sought connection. That responsiveness was not a flaw. It was an adaptive trait within an unstable context. Vulnerability in such cases arises not from character weakness but from environmental fragility. Children cannot evaluate adult intent with adult cognition. They rely on surrounding systems to provide filtration. The hidden cracks beneath this case include economic inequality, overstretched public infrastructure, and segmented accountability across agencies. These contextual forces do not excuse potential criminal behavior. They illuminate the conditions in which predatory behavior can advance undetected. Structural stress increases blind spots. Fragmentation slows response. The most devastating realization may be this. If even one link in the protective chain had held firmly, if documentation had been verified immediately, if unusual proximity had triggered review, if interagency alerts had synchronized earlier, the trajectory might have changed. Prevention often hinges on timing. Instead, the links bent under cumulative pressure. The space between institutions widened just enough for silence to settle. And within that silence, a child disappeared not from a remote wilderness, but from the interior seams of a city built on governance. Before examining the theories, it is important to acknowledge a central reality. When physical evidence is incomplete and the primary person of interest, Kahlil Tatum, is deceased, the truth can no longer be clarified through direct testimony. The investigation into the disappearance of Relisha Rudd therefore shifts from prosecution to analysis of behavior, timelines, and confirmed facts. In the space between what is known and what has never been recovered, theories begin to form not to replace truth, but to approach it cautiously and systematically. Theory A. Direct responsibility of Kahlil Tatum. Theory A argues that the most direct explanation is the most probable, that Kahlil Tatum personally harmed Relisha Rudd. The known facts align closely with this view. He was the last confirmed adult seen with her on hotel surveillance footage in March 2014. He forged medical notes to justify more than 30 school absences. As scrutiny increased, his wife, Kahlil Tatum, was found shot in a Maryland hotel room. He then fled and later died by suicide. In Washington, D.C., from an evidentiary standpoint, proximity carries substantial weight in criminal investigations. Records indicate that Kahlil Tatum rented multiple hotel rooms in Washington, D.C., and Maryland, while accompanied by Relisha Rudd. After late March 2014, no verified surveillance footage documented her alive. In missing child cases, the last confirmed adult seen with a child typically becomes a primary investigative focus. Psychologically, the sequence suggests escalating panic. Forgery indicates deliberate deception. The homicide of his wife may signal crisis or exposure anxiety. Flight suggests fear of apprehension, and suicide may reflect collapse under pressure. The pattern forms a coherent arc. Its weakness is decisive. No publicly confirmed physical evidence links him directly to her death. Without recovered remains or forensic confirmation, she remains officially missing. Theory B. Accidental harm followed by concealment. Theory B considers a different psychological trajectory. It suggests that an accidental event may have occurred while Relisha was in Tatum's care, perhaps injury, overdose, or unintended fatal harm followed by concealment out of fear. In this framework, the forged notes initially served to maintain access rather than to cover a homicide. When something unexpected occurred, panic drove escalation. This theory attempts to explain the rapid sequence of violence. If an accidental death happened, Tatum may have feared prosecution. The subsequent murder of his wife could reflect desperation to prevent disclosure if she became aware. Suicide then becomes an expression of guilt, shame, or inevitability. However, Theory B remains speculative. There is no public evidence indicating accidental injury. Investigators did not disclose forensic findings supporting such a scenario. While psychologically plausible in abstract terms, the absence of concrete indicators weakens its explanatory strength compared to Theory C. Stranger abduction after hotel departure. Theory C proposes that Relisha may have left the hotel alive and encountered another offender. This scenario suggests that Tatum's role, while suspicious, did not directly involve homicide. Instead, she could have become vulnerable to third-party exploitation or abduction. Theoretically, the absence of a body creates space for this possibility. Urban environments contain transient populations, and surveillance coverage is incomplete. However, investigators have not presented evidence of a third party accompanying her. Surveillance footage did not reveal another individual interacting with her during confirmed sightings. Moreover, timing complicates this theory. Tatum's wife was killed. He fled immediately afterward. His suicide followed weeks later. These actions imply internal crises rather than external coincidence, without tangible indicators of stranger involvement. Theory C lacks evidentiary support. Theory D. Broader knowledge within the shelter environment. Theory D widens the lens. It proposes that someone else within the communal shelter environment may possess undisclosed knowledge. Large facilities such as the former D.C. General Family Shelter housed hundreds of residents. Overlapping interactions were inevitable. It is conceivable that additional information remains unreported or was never fully investigated. Public records show that the shelter system faced scrutiny for oversight failures. Reviews by the Office of the Inspector General of the District of Columbia cited communication breakdowns between agencies. In fragmented systems, information can be siloed. Someone may have observed something ambiguous without realizing its significance, yet no credible suspect beyond. Tatum has emerged with corroborated evidence. Law enforcement statements consistently identified him as the primary person of interest. No arrests of alternative suspects have occurred. Theory D therefore remains hypothetical rather than substantiated. When comparing these theories, Theory A remains the most consistent with documented facts. It accounts for the forged medical documentation, confirmed proximity at hotels, the the homicide of his spouse, his flight, and his suicide. The behavioral pattern aligns with concealment, followed by collapse. However, consistency is not the same as certainty. In the absence of physical confirmation, no recovered remains and no publicly disclosed forensic evidence directly linking Kahlil Tatum to the death of Relisha Rudd, the case lacks definitive closure. In criminal analysis, circumstantial alignment can strengthen probability, but it does not meet the threshold of proof beyond reasonable doubt. True crime analysis demands disciplined restraint. The absence of evidence is not proof that something did not occur, but neither does it justify ungrounded speculation. Responsible examination requires separating confirmed facts from inference. Theories serve as frameworks tools to organize timelines, behaviors, and documented actions into coherent patterns. They can clarify probability, highlight inconsistencies, and expose unanswered questions. But they are analytical models, not verdicts. Without forensic confirmation or judicial findings, interpretation must remain provisional. In this case, the available facts most strongly indicate the direct involvement of Kahlil Tatum in the disappearance of Relisha Rudd. His proximity, his deception, violence, and suicide form a troubling sequence. Yet critical uncertainties persist. Where did the crime occur? When did it happen? Why was no physical evidence publicly recovered? These unresolved elements prevent definitive closure. Ultimately, theories can approximate understanding, but approximation is not certainty. Until new evidence emerges, the truth remains partially obscured, structured by probability, yet incomplete. Relisha's silence reverberates beyond the possibility of a single offender. It echoes through systems, institutions, and collective blind spots. When a child disappears without resolution, the event is not confined to one relationship or one alleged act. It exposes the architecture surrounding that child. In the case of Relisha Rudd, the unanswered questions illuminate not only the conduct of Kahlil Tatum, but also the fragility of overlapping safeguards meant to prevent exactly such harm. Criminal psychology has long observed that predatory behavior rarely emerges in chaotic randomness. It is adaptive. Offenders assess risk environments. They look for lowered supervision, inconsistent oversight, and guardians stretched beyond capacity. Opportunity is not merely discovered, it is cultivated. Routine activities theory suggests that crime occurs when a motivated offender converges with a suitable target in the absence of capable guardianship. The troubling implication is structural. Harm often requires more than intent, it requires access. When oversight thins, when communication falters, when bureaucratic processes normalize irregularities, the environment itself becomes permissive. Creditors test boundaries incrementally. They offer assistance, they observe reactions, they exploit gratitude. Trust is seldom seized. It is built, layer by layer. In vulnerable communities, particularly those navigating housing, instability or administrative dependency authority can appear benevolent before it reveals coercion. Sociologically, vulnerability compresses decision-making, bandwidth. Immediate survival eclipses abstract suspicion. The margin for exhaustive vetting narrows. Within that compression, exploitation can masquerade as help. To say that Relisha was a victim solely of one man's potential cruelty may be legally precise, yet socially incomplete. Structural fragility complicates moral comfort. Institutions exist to compensate for individual strain. When multiple institutions fail to synchronize schools, shelters, social services, the diffusion of responsibility becomes visible. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt described the banality of evil not as monstrous intent, but as ordinary systems operating without reflective judgment. Harm does not always erupt from dramatic malice. Sometimes it advances through procedural inertia. Western ethical traditions emphasize individual accountability. If Tatum committed these acts, the moral weight rests squarely upon him. Kantian ethics would argue that using another human being merely as a means violates the categorical imperative. The intentional exploitation of a child would constitute a profound moral transgression, regardless of circumstance. Justice systems reflect this emphasis. Culpability is assigned to actors, not abstractions. Law seeks a person to answer for harm, yet other philosophical traditions broaden the lens. Confucian thought situates responsibility within relational networks. Disorder in one relationship signals imbalance in the broader harmony. When institutions neglect coordination, The failure is not isolated. It reflects breakdown across interconnected roles. Similarly, Buddhist philosophy frames suffering as arising from ignorance, not merely of facts, but of interdependence. When awareness fractures across agencies, harm multiplies in the gaps between them. Christian theology introduces another dimension: confession and redemption. Sin is acknowledged, responsibility articulated, repentance expressed. In this case, the primary suspect died without confession. There was no admission, no explicit reckoning, no narrative closure. Augustine wrote that truth liberates because it brings hidden realities into light. The absence of confession withholds that illumination. Without articulated wrongdoing, the moral arc feels suspended. Justice cannot fully proceed when the central voice is permanently silent. This silence creates what psychologists term ambiguous loss. Unlike confirmed death, ambiguous disappearance prevents the completion of mourning. Hope coexists painfully with dread. Families oscillate between preparing for grief and clinging to possibility. Pauline Boss, who developed the concept, argues that ambiguous loss freezes coping mechanisms. Without definitive information, rituals of closure remain inaccessible. In Relisha's case, uncertainty becomes a second wound layered atop the first. Philosophically, ambiguity unsettles our desire for narrative coherence. Humans construct meaning through stories with beginnings, climaxes, and endings. An unresolved disappearance resists that structure. It interrupts the moral expectation that wrongdoing will be exposed and truth revealed. Existentialist thinkers like Camus confronted a similar discomfort. The world does not guarantee resolution. The absurd lies not in cruelty alone, but in the absence of satisfying explanation. Investigatively, possibilities remain open. Advances in forensic science continue to refine DNA analysis. Cold case methodologies evolve, incorporating digital re-examination of archived evidence and geospatial reassessment of prior search areas. Witnesses once constrained by fear or loyalty sometimes reconsider with time. Technology has, in other cases, revived dormant investigations decades later. Yet time is ambivalent. While scientific tools sharpen, memories erode, and physical traces degrade. The passage of years both opens doors and closes them. Beyond forensic hope lies civic reflection. What is more destabilizing? The existence of a single individual capable of harm, or a network of institutions that fail to activate in time? A solitary offender suggests anomaly, deviation from the norm. Systemic breakdown suggests vulnerability, embedded within the norm itself. The former can be condemned and removed. The latter demands reform, vigilance, and sustained accountability. Modern bureaucracies prize efficiency. Standardization accelerates processing. Caseload, metrics, measure productivity. Yet philosopher Ivan Illich warned that institutional efficiency can outpace attentiveness. When anomalies resemble routine irregularities, scrutiny dulls. Overextended caseworkers, triage, visible emergencies, quiet drift, escapes escalation. No single lapse appears catastrophic. Collectively, they can form corridors through which risk advances undetected. Relisha's disappearance thus occupies dual identities. It is a criminal mystery anchored to specific individuals and timelines. It is also a civic indictment to mirror, reflecting how fragmented oversight can fail the most vulnerable. Silence, in this sense, performs two functions. It conceals secrets, but it also exposes neglect. The absence of definitive answers compels society to interrogate its own safeguards. Ultimately, the philosophical gravity of the case extends beyond discovering what happened. It demands scrutiny of how it remained hidden. If individual guilt is proven, it carries moral and legal consequence. Yet collective vulnerability calls for institutional self-examination. The silence that lingers denies closure and sustains ambiguity, but it also insists on vigilance. Whether solved or not, the enduring lesson is clear. Protection requires accountability, coordination, and unwavering awareness. Relisha Rudd vanished not only from her family's sight, but from the protective framework of a city that should have shielded her. Her disappearance is a reminder that tragedy rarely announces itself as spectacle. More often, it begins quietly with a forged signature excusing school absences, with missed warning signs rationalized as misunderstandings. with an adult whose behavior feels unsettling yet not urgent enough to challenge. Small oversights accumulate, silence expands, and by the time alarm fully sounds, the window for intervention may already have narrowed. The case remains open, and the questions remain precise and persistent. Somewhere within the fractures between institutional procedure and human judgment lies the fuller truth of what unfolded in 2014. If this story has moved you, share your reflections below. Like, share, and subscribe so more cases can be explored with care and depth. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mind.